I found my way to Berea by a long and winding road. I first went to graduate school in the South at UNC Chapel Hill, and that was after I'd grown up in Los Angeles, went to college in Chicago, and lived for a little while in London, England. But my interests were in Southern history and Southern culture. That's how I found my way here, because there was a job opening here. And I knew about Berea, about its place in American history. And when I saw they wanted an American historian, I thought, oh, that's me. That's me. You want me, actually. So I applied, and here I am. Let's go back to the beginning. That's how I found them. I found them in the early 19th century. And in the early 19th century, to be a primitive Baptist was to be somebody, a Baptist, an evangelical, a Protestant, who had big problems with a lot of the things that were going on in evangelical churches and in Baptist churches. Specifically, primitive Baptists were against missionaries and missions in general. They were against formal theological training for ministers. They were against the entire apparatus that was being built up by evangelical congregations across the country to serve other ends than simply preaching the gospel directly to people in the pews. Primitive Baptists objected to all of this, and they also held firm to Calvinist tradition, beliefs in predestination was absolutely crucial to them. They saw their world slipping away, and they said, no, things have to change. And so what happened was people who were simply identified themselves as Baptist separated from other Baptists and called themselves, eventually called themselves primitive Baptists. I found them first in the very early 19th century. The movement begins in the 18 teens, really takes off in the 1820s and flowers across the 30s and 40s. What I wanted to know was, where did they come from before, even before that? And if I listened to the primitive Baptists themselves, they said that you could just trace a direct line from them all the way back to the apostolic church, the church around Jesus Christ. And if you listen to the primitive Baptist opponents, they would say, no, 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 no. These people are all wrong, and what you need to do is follow us, missionary Baptists. And if you can follow us, you'd follow us all the way back through the distant mists of time, and you would find that this path would lead straight to Jesus and his disciples. So both groups said there's a direct line from Jesus to us. Both of us, they're both saying we're the true church, we're the right church. And so what I needed to do was listen to those voices, but also as a historian be, of course, deeply skeptical of those types of origin stories, and instead find the beginning of the primitive Baptist movement not that far back in time. The roots of the movement are in the early 19th century and in religious and economic and theological and emotional changes that are happening at that moment in time. I heard them first. I heard them singing, and it's the sound that captured me. It was the sound of their singing that got me interested in them. I put on a tape I was working in folk life archives, and I put on a tape of primitive Baptist singing. I was not at all familiar with it. I pressed play, and I was going to do my job of data entry to pay my rent, and I heard this music, this singing, and it just stopped me dead. I'd never heard anything like it. It sounded to me at the time like people calling up spirits. It sounded luminous, and it sounded funereal. It sounded mysterious. It reminded me of some old twisting cantorial melodies that I'd heard in synagogue growing up as a Jew. Mostly I just found it mesmerizing and beautiful, and I wanted to know where this singing came from. Who were these people? Why were they singing like that? How was that singing doing its magic on me? And so the project just started from there, and this curiosity, but also this kinship with the sound. And then the more I listened to the music, the more questions I had, and then the more questions I had, the more I do some more exploring and find out who these people were. And the more I found out about who the primitive Baptists were, the more I thought, there's a story here. There's a story here, and I want to tell it. The reason why I found music so important to telling the primitive Baptist story is my sense that through listening to how people sing and where they sing and figuring out why they sing, you can tell a lot about them. That you don't just need traditional records if you're a historian. We might go to old church records, conversion narratives, things like that, and those are incredibly useful, and I use them. But there's something about when religious people raise their voice in song, there's just a lot of meaning there. And so I felt if I wanted to tell a story about who these people were and why they did what they did, let's get really close to them. And their singing comes right from their heart, right from their souls. For me, the primitives offer us an amazing window into the American past. They're a small group, but their significance outstrips their numbers. So if you look at them and their roots in the early 19th century, what you see was this takes us back to the beginnings of the Southern Bible Belt. And what you find then is that the beginnings of the Southern Bible Belt, the story there is a story about fighting, about conflict, about debates within the evangelical community about which type of Protestantism would prevail. The primitives insisted on an older style of Calvinism. They were against the changes sweeping the other evangelical churches, things like missionaries, massive fundraising operations for foreign and domestic missions and theological schools and Sunday schools and Bible tract societies. All of that was anathema to them. They looked at religious revivals very skeptically and thought they were theaters of emotional and spiritual manipulation in large part. So by looking at their story early on, you see not only that the beginnings of the Bible Belt were not as uniform as we might have thought at first, but you get this sense of what might have been, of a road not taken. Because, of course, the primitive Baptists lost. Their version of Christianity did not carry the day. The second thing is with their music and the ways that they're their music has sort of seeped into American popular culture. And for me, you can hear that clearly in certain old time and bluegrass singers. And so I listen carefully and write about Ralph Stanley and Roscoe Holcomb and the ways in which Old Baptist and Primitive Baptist singing styles shape those performers' music. The biggest example, the one that just also hit me was, I guess it's this was, I'm blanking. Let me try to think. I know. Okay. So I'm driving around in my Volkswagen. This is the early 2000s. And I'm listening to country music radio. And the song "Oh Death" comes on. And it's Ralph Stanley, this bluegrass legend, chanting out this deathbed dirge. And hearing that on country music radio will make your mind do all sorts of strange things. It was unexpected. What was going on? And what happened was that song was part of this "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" soundtrack. And people were mesmerized by that performance. It won Stanley a Grammy. And that record that has sold, I think, maybe 10 million copies. It's been massive. And it was strange that an old, unaccompanied hymn sung in that quavering Primitive Baptist style had captured the American imagination. And I just wondered why that was. So you can hear Primitive Baptist echoes in his voice, and in somebody's voice like Roscoe Holcomb's, who was a star on the folk revival circuit in the 1960s and 1970s. And what you hear there is a kind of old Baptist spirit that has been sort of seeped into modern American culture, or sort of been brought up into the present. And modern audiences hear something in it that isn't quite in line with Primitive Baptist theology. They hear a kind of lonesomeness and sometimes a kind of existential questioning that is connected to Primitive Baptist feeling and thought, but isn't quite identical with it. Whether Primitive Baptists will continue to influence American culture, to what extent, is an open question. I'm a historian, so getting me to think about the future makes me really uncomfortable and nervous. But here, let me try. On the one hand, look, Primitive Baptists represent an older style of Christianity, a kind of evangelicalism that is very comfortable with doubt. And that is just not the kind of Christianity that prevails in most Baptist and Methodist churches across the South. So that Primitive Baptists are here, they're kind of a standing reminder of a different type of Christianity. As far as their influence on music, yes, I think it will continue, because I think so much Southern roots music finds itself drawn irresistibly back to this thing that Ralph Stanley and Roscoe Holcomb and Primitive Baptists before them and Old Regular Baptists before them described as the lonesome sound. And that lonesome sound, which is in some way the sound of a Calvinist pilgrim, a stranger below, someone walking the earth desperately in search of God's grace, that kind of feeling will find its way into Southern roots music or into American roots music. I think it's irresistible, and I think it speaks to people across time. the way that my research and teaching work together, it's like this. Sometimes I could bring in some of my research directly, and we might look at it as a class. That's happened, but it's rare. Mostly the way that things are connected between my research and writing, such as this book, Strangers Below, and my teaching in American religious history and Christianity, is that the person I am in the classroom is absolutely formed by my research and writing and by my desire to understand the texture of believers' lives, to make sense of them and to tell their stories. And that person who does that research in the archives is still the same person, the same teacher. I'm animated by those same impulses. And so I try to bring those into the classroom directly. Berea's had a big impact on this book. Now, I wrote a lot of it before I came here, but the college has helped me immensely, and there are the practical things, giving me money for research trips, supporting my research by paying travel to conferences, things like that. Those are concrete, but equally as important, if not more important, have been these other things. And that has simply been the conversations really with my students, first and foremost. And when you teach American religious history, or you teach our course, Understandings of Christianity here, that course forces you, or all these courses forces you to think. They force you to think. And they make you a student along with your students. And so I've been a kind of perpetual student here, even though I'm a professor. And those classes and my students have just sharpened my thinking. They've made me a much better teacher, a much better writer, a much better student of American religion. So it's impossible for me to conceive of the book as it is without the help of the college and my students. I've got a few different things I'm thinking about. As a writer, my next project is still a little undefined, but I want to tell a story, or really a series of stories, about marginal, small religious groups in the early 19th century. I want these stories to be freestanding but also linked, and I want them to let us get beneath and behind what historians still glibly refer to as the Second Great Awakening. There was a variety of religious activity and creativity just seething beneath that label, the Second Great Awakening, and I want to tell those stories.